Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started. Thank you for being here. I want to welcome everyone to Arizona State University. I'm Iracema Coronado. I'm director of the School of Transborder Studies, and we're very happy that you're here to join us for this event. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that there are 23 Native nations that have inhabited this land for centuries. Arizona State University's 4 campuses are located in the Salt River Valley, on ancestral territories of indigenous peoples, including the Acamelo Odam, the Pima, the Pipash Maricopa Indian communities, whose care and keeping of these lands allow us to be here today. ASU acknowledges the sovereignty of these nations and seeks to foster an environment of success and possibility for Native American students and patrons. We're advocates for the incorporation of indigenous knowledge systems and research methodologies within ASU. I would like to share a little bit with you about the School of Transborder Studies. It is the only one of its kind in the United States. It promotes academic excellence and social change by developing cutting-edge interdisciplinary knowledge regarding the populations of the US-Mexico transborder space and beyond. We affect social change by developing and nurturing integrated scholarship and teaching, leading to more successful and sustainable transborder communities. Our motto is at the center of expertise and action, we make borders human. We offer classes, a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a PhD program. Our graduates have become academics, lawyers, leaders in the nonprofit world, legislators, and if I had to say what they have in common is their commitment to social justice and to serve our communities. Our faculty are world-renowned and are great mentors and provide opportunities to our students to conduct research. At this time, I want to thank the staff and the faculty of the School of Transborder Studies, Patricia Corona, Tracy Simpson, Dustin Davila Bojorquez, Rebecca Alvarado Ortega, because they did a lot of the work to make this event happen. So if we can give them all a they do a lot of heavy lifting, and we're very appreciative of all of your efforts. I would also like to thank my ASU colleague, Rafael Martinez, for agreeing to serve on this panel, as well as our community partners, Jose Patiño from Aliento and Dulce Juarez, a community activist. This event is a joint event. This is a joint event in partnership with the Center for US and Mexico at Rice University. So I would also like to thank the staff at Rice University that also contribute to making this event a success. I'm going to introduce the director of the US and Mexico Center at Rice University, Dr. Tony Payan, who will orchestrate this panel discussion. Tony Payan is a Françoise and Edward Digerin Fellow for Mexico Studies at Director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. He's also a professor of social sciences at the Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez in Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, Mexico. Between 2001 and 2015, Professor Payan was at the University of Texas at El Paso in the political science department, which is where we became friends, and we were colleagues there for quite a long time. His research focuses on border studies, particularly the US-Mexico border, and he's looking at issues of borderlands as areas of habitation, including the various conditions that affect life in liminal spaces. This includes cross-border flows, both legal and illegal, of people and contraband, as well as border governance. He's the author of 2 books, Cops, Soldiers, and Diplomats, Understanding Agency Behavior in the War on Drugs, and the 3 US-Mexico border wars, drugs, immigration, and homeland security. He has also written a plethora of other books, has co-edited several books and several academic journal articles. I want to welcome him to ASU, and Tony, you have the floor.
Thank you, Iracema. It's truly a pleasure to be here at Arizona State University. As Iracema said, I began my career at the University of Texas at El Paso in 2001. Iracema was already there, and I have the pleasure to count Iracema among my friends and mentors when I got to the University of Texas at El Paso, right out of Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I spent those 15 years at the University of Texas at El Paso, which I think it's a kind of a natural laboratory, because when you study border issues, border studies in general, and you live on the border, right, literally a stone's throw from the borderline, which we were, then your laboratory, your space of research is the borderlands. It's right there. And so you see all kinds of issues of border governability issues, inhabitability issues, and of course, cross-border flows, both legal and illegalized. So it was a pleasure to see Iracema move on to ASU, because I think she's a fantastic collaborator with us. At the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute in Houston, Texas, which is where I live now, we dedicate 24 hours a day to look at issues that pertain to the binational relationship. They have to do with clearly binational issues. And I think between those two countries, hardly anything is truly domestic. I think most issues are intermestic, so to speak. And I think immigration is one of them. So in the last few years, thanks to a number of grants, we've dedicated a lot of time to thinking about immigration. So what I want to do is share with you a couple of thoughts about the immigration issue as we look at it, and then introduce our panelists to have a really good conversation. It'll be first among us over here on the stage, and then we'll open it to a conversation with you. So this is an open conversation thinking about immigration and immigration issues. Let me go back a little bit in history to think about immigration. For the very first 100 years of the Republic, immigration really was open in this country. The United States did not have a visa system, system with categories of all kinds of visas that we have today: B visas, H visas, J visas, O visas, M visas, V visas, H-1B, H-2B, H-2A, and on and on. There's like a whole gamut of visas that this country uses today to classify and organize flows into the country, both immigrant and non-immigrant. This system wasn't really born until the late 1800s, 100 years after the Republic began. The 20th century, however, saw bit by bit the organization of the US immigration system. And I think there are some specific characteristics that the US system, immigration system, has gravitated towards, which I think are worth mentioning, because I think they're part of the conversation today, and they're going to be an important part of what we'll be talking about today if we want to understand the evolution of the immigration system today. What we saw in the 20th century is the bureaucratization, the rationalization, presumed rationalization of the US immigration system, and the rise of the immigration bureaucracy, particularly after World War I and towards the 1920s, when the US creates the Border Patrol to maintain a certain degree of control on the immigration flows on the southern and northern borders. Many of the states also began to intervene in on the immigration, and there were places like New York and Massachusetts, which were already heavy immigrant states, that began to implement their own systems to oppose additional immigration from Europe. And then there were other states, particularly in the West, as the country expanded westward, that wanted more immigrants. So the states have always played this important role in the immigration system in the United States. And they reversed roles. At some point, Massachusetts and New York were very much against immigration because they were already considered overcrowded. And some states in the West were open to immigration, and they wanted additional numbers of migrants to come into the United States. And today, the roles has reversed. Some states like Texas, where I live, and Arizona, for example, are slightly more anti-immigrant in their sentiments. And then there are some states like New York and California that have turned around and are much more immigrant friendly. So the states themselves have their own dynamics and their own attitudes towards immigration. Of course, over time, the courts and the federal government have essentially monopolized the issue of immigration and try to suppress much of what the states can do. Of course, the states can make life very, very difficult for immigrants, as you well know here in Arizona, and we know in Texas. But at the end of the day, the states cannot do more than the federal government dictates. So the states very often mirror the policies at the national level. But that doesn't mean, of course, that there isn't a whole debate, both at the local and state level, as well as at the national level. Now, immigration over time evolved as well as the federal government gained control over the immigration system, and the state sort of receded in the background to a large extent. Immigration itself evolved. And in the very beginning, if we go back to the 1800s, the very first thing that the United States did was to try to control immigration, which was largely open. Almost anyone could come in. And most of the screening was about public health. If somebody was sick coming from Europe, or somebody was a well-known criminal, et cetera, they would be screened and then sent back to Europe to some extent. But in the 1890s, the United States established the immigration inspector, and that was located in the Treasury Department. That was the place to control immigration. But there wasn't a visa system. So it was mostly to ensure that it was the right people coming in and that they were not sick, they didn't bring any public health issues and things like that. By 1903, however, the United States understood the link between labor markets and immigration and moved the immigration services to the Labor and Commerce Department, which at that time were a single department in 1903. But slowly over time, as the Great Depression came in and lots of immigrants were deported, particularly to Mexico, the US government began to see immigration as an enforcement activity, trying to determine what were the classes of aliens that were desirable or excludable from the country. And so the Border Patrol is created in the 1920s, the INS is created in the 1940s, and immigration moves to the Justice Department. And so that clearly gives immigration an outlook of law enforcement. And that's where it all begins. Of course, by the 2000s, after 2001 and September 11th, the immigration acquires a new character and it becomes a matter of national security. And so the immigration services move to the Department of Homeland Security. So you can see it from Treasury to Labor and Commerce to the Justice Department to Homeland Security. And of course, words matter. Whatever you label immigration matters, and it becomes very important because that determines the kind of orientation in public policy and the kinds of tools that you're going to use to regulate immigration. And so immigrants go from being simple individuals migrating to the country with an open border, moving to the West, to individuals subject to the labor markets, and the U.S. begins to sort of consider, for example, the Bracero program is a labor market issue, and then, of course, they become subject to law enforcement, and today, national security. And so immigrants are viewed through the lens of national security. So there's clearly an evolution of the immigration issue. What is an excludable alien? What is a desirable alien? That's a difficult thing to determine, but that gives the federal government an enormous ability to determine who can stay in the country and who cannot. And in fact, we are today at the point at which anyone that is not a citizen, even green card holders, are under a probationary system. We are under what we call a permanent probation system. Anybody can be taken away, anybody can be deported. Even those who have a green card are not assured that they can stay in the country because their green card can be taken away very easily and go away. So we essentially moved into this type of probationary model of immigration, and nobody is safe except perhaps those that are citizens. And even minor offenses cause the government to often take away individuals' statuses and send them abroad in deportation. So that has radically changed the immigration model. Of course, bureaucratic habits, as we developed the deportation state in which we live today, clearly we have to define who is somebody who is admissible into the United States and who's not admissible. The problem is that, as everything in public policy, there are unintended consequences. For example, when in 1952, through the INA, or the Immigration and Naturalization Act, we created the family reunification system. The idea was that there were less visas for workers. So as we moved the immigration system into the Justice Department and we favored family reunification, the consequence was less visas for workers. And of course, the United States economy has been so vibrant throughout all these decades that there is an incredible demand for labor, but then we created a bottleneck for actual workers to enter the United States, favoring family reunification. And so that creates an incentive for people to come in without papers, without documents into the country, because there are jobs, and we created a bottleneck with a huge, giant sucking sound for workers on one end, but very few and limited visa paths for additional workers, because 60% of the visas go to families. And then, of course, we increase enforcement, and enforcement, as we build the enforcement state, or the deportation state, as we create enforcement, we create incentives for people to end circular migration and to stay put in the United States. And that's what increases also the number of undocumented workers and undocumented residents in the United States. So it is another policy that kind of backfires. When we build walls like Trump did, for example, we see that we incentivize additional individuals and groups, particularly criminal groups, who then have an incentive to offer their services to go under the wall, over the wall, or around the wall. So the wall itself creates its own criminal incentives, or incentives for the emergence of criminal groups. And so that's yet one more policy that clearly backfires. When we created nationality caps in the United States, and you have 20,000 visas assigned to Mexico, for example, for green cards, but you have 600,000 Mexicans that want to enter the United States. What you have is 580,000 Mexicans that have no path into the United States and will simply just take the undocumented route into the United States. So examining our own policies and the way we deal with immigration, I think, is important, because it is a crisis of our own making. And we ourselves have deprived the government and the citizenry of the tools needed to ensure that there are enough immigrants to satisfy the needs of the country. Now, there are some authors that argue that this mismatch between the need for immigrants and the narrow paths for immigrants to come into the country is by design, that there is something that was done by design, because it is a tool. Immigration has become a tool of social control. It is a way in which local governments, state governments, and the federal government exercise a degree of social control on the population, particularly when you think about the fact that the United States has 42 million people that were born in a different country, and half of them are today non-citizens, and half of that are undocumented residents. So in the last few years, what we've seen is contradictions. For example, and we'll talk about this in a minute with our panelists, as I conclude my remarks, we've seen paradoxes. The Obama administration was, for example, a great paradox. I call it the Obama paradox, right? He was the great deporter in chief. He deported over 4 million people from the United States through domestic, that is interior enforcement, as well as removals at the border and returns at the border, while at the same time offering by virtue of the presidential powers, offering entire classes of groups a status, some sort of status within his powers within the United States. For example, DACA. DACA is a typical program that the president believes is within his purview, and his choice to implement or not implement or rechannel resources of law enforcement and focus on certain groups and not focus on other groups. And of course, that's contested in the courts. And so far, the courts have sided with the presidency. So clearly, slowly, bit by bit, immigration has been centralized in the federal government. It has been centralized in the presidency, and Congress has failed to act. If you think about congressional bills, we had one of a number of bills, I guess, the Chinese Exclusion Acts in the 1880s, and then we had another bill early in the 1900s, and then we had another bill in 1952, another one in 1964, another one in 86, another one in 96, and we haven't had another bill for almost 30 years now. So clearly Congress has given up on its ability and its power to regulate immigration and to satisfy the immigration needs of the country. And presidents have had to find creative ways from their own position to deal with immigration. And so here we are today. So understanding the history of the evolution of and the concepts that belie the immigration system is really, really important for understanding the kind of conversation that we're going to have. One more thing that I want to say is perhaps in this design of this kind of a structural mismatch in the number of visas that the United States grants for immigrants and the kind of immigration demands that the country has at all levels, in all kinds, for example, in labor markets, perhaps I think we can think that in pushing Congress to act, but it is very difficult to get Congress to move. And so we are living with this mismatch. The fact that this country is able to absorb many more immigrants than the system is allowed to enter into the United States. And so what we have is an incredible mismatch that only Congress can resolve, because presidents can only do it from their stand. And of course, they're open to being challenged by the states like Texas and Arizona, by individuals, and of course, political parties like the Republican Party, for example, which tends to challenge many of these executive orders. And of course, it becomes an important component of the political landscape. So it's quite a complicated landscape that we see today. So to have this conversation on where we are today, just having given you kind of a 30,000-foot view of the evolution of the immigration system in the United States and some key concepts, and there are many, many more, I want to introduce our panelists so that we can have a conversation first among ourselves and then with you. First, we have Dr. Rafael Martinez. Dr. Rafael Martinez is an assistant professor of Southwest Borderlands in the College of Integrative Sciences and Arts. Dr. Martinez's work focuses on immigration, migration, the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, and the American Southwest. At ASU, he teaches courses on the American Southwest, the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, and Arizona history. As an advocate of community-based history projects, he's engaged in public projects that seek to connect academic work with community development, which I understand is a great mission and vision of the University of Arizona State University, correct. The University of the State of Arizona, Arizona State University. Thank you. Thank you, Rosamond. Yes. Dulce Juarez is next in the panel. Dulce Juarez, a master's in education, brings more than 2 decades of organizing and advocacy experience in the immigrants' rights movement. She has advocated for the passage of the DREAM Act, worked at the American Civil Liberties Union, served as a community partnership consultant for Movement Voters Project, and joined Chispa, Arizona in 2019 as an organizing director before serving as Chispa, Arizona co-executive director. She currently works at the AZ Donor Alliance, which supports local nonprofit organizations in creating positive systematic change. Her passion is advancing environmental justice and building BIPOC political power for a progressive, inclusive, and healthier world. And we got Jose Patiño. Jose Patiño was born in Mexico and raised in Maryvale. He migrated at the age of 6 with his family. Jose is an educator, advocate, and DACA recipient. Jose holds a BSE in mechanical engineering from ASU and an MED from GCU. He has advocated migrants. There's something wrong here. He has advocated immigrants' grants rights since 2007. He stopped a bus of undocumented immigrants set to be deported, engaged in a direct action, which he interrupted President Barack Obama's speech, and lobbied for the DREAM Act and immigration reform, Jose Aliento Ciento Proposition 308, and state tuition and access to scholarships for all Arizona students, regardless of immigration status campaign. So we'll proceed giving each of our guests 5 to 7 minutes to present their own views and their own thoughts and understanding of the immigration system today. And then Dr. Coronado and I will ask them some questions, and then we'll open it to a conversation with you. And greetings to my friend Carlos back there. Thank you. I guess we'll start with you, Dr. Martinez.
Mic check. Good. Órale. Buenas tardes, everybody. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Transborder Studies for organizing this event and bringing us all together to have a conversation around these important and timely manners, right? And so, as you mentioned a little bit about my bio, my work focuses primarily on immigrant rights and more specifically looking at the history of undocumented youth social movements in the United States. Really answering the question, when we think of immigrant rights today, we think of undocumented youth as the face or the broader face of the larger immigrant rights movements. That was not the case, as you heard a little bit from the historical analysis, where the immigrant rights was traditionally seen as a labor rights movement, right? And undocumented youth really came to the forefront of changing how we talk about immigrant rights in the United States. And so my book that I'm working on wrapping up right now and is off to the press is looking at particularly that, looking at case studies in particular moments in which undocumented youth took us to specific sites that the general public around the United States did not have access or had not seen or did not document priorly, like detention centers, right? Nowadays, we know about some of the human rights violations that exist inside of detention centers, but back, going back to previous to 2011, some of those things were not documented, right? And it took undocumented youth to push the boundaries of how we could bring inside information to some of these sites and basically start talking about these things, right? And so that's been a work in progress, basically since my undergrad years to my graduate years, and also has been a personal life journey as a first generation immigrant in the United States and growing through a lot of those experiences as well, is to be able to write about that. But yeah, I'll leave it at that and I'll open it up to some of my co-panelists.
Thank you, Rafael. My name is Dulce Juarez. If you would allow me, I'd like to introduce myself by honoring where I come from. So I am the daughter of Luz Maria Aguilar and the daughter of Jose Luis Juarez. My mother migrated here to the US by herself first, left me and my sister Ana, who's also in the audience, left us with my grandma in Obregón, Sonora, Mexico when I was 5. She went back to get my sister and I and told us we're going to Disneyland. And that didn't happen. We migrated to Arizona. She came here in search of a better future. She was leaving an abusive relationship at that time with my father. And she migrated here, became a nanny at a wealthy home, watching children of this wealthy family. And we grew up here. We came here. We had to adapt. There was a lot of cultural differences coming from Mexico to here, right? There was a lot of adapting that we had to do and a lot of learning, cultural differences, language, cultural norms, things that we didn't understand. Thankfully, though, I wanted to share a little bit about how I became politicized. I was very fortunate that I had great mentors who mentored me and who would tell me, you have to dream big and you have to go to college. But in my mind, I knew at a young age, I was like, I don't think I can go to college because I don't have a social security number. And my mentors, Mr. Trujillo, rest in peace, he was a Chicano elder from the Chicano movement of the 1960s who was from Colorado. And he was one of our school counselors. And he would tell me, you got to go to school. You got to go to school. And Miss Quimby, she was from the farmers workers movement. She and her sister had picked onions and lettuce with Cesar Chavez and were her family, before they went to school, they would go and pick lettuce and pick food and then would go to school. So I grew up around people that really mentored me and that really, if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be here today, to be honest. I'm very grateful for them. They made sure that I didn't give up. Fast forward, I got a full ride to ASU. I'm actually an ASU alum. I got everything paid for on a full ride scholarship based on merit. And it was taken away by Prop 300, which passed 16 years ago. It was a law that passed here in Arizona in 2006, with 71% of voters voting yes to take away scholarships from students like myself who had great amazing grades, who did community service, who was a community leader, and voters voted to take away our scholarships. So that was kind of a blessing in disguise because there was around 278 students at ASU that we didn't know were all undocumented, and it brought us together. So that's a little bit about how my journey started. I'll share more in a little bit, but I want to pass it on to my friend Jose, who was also here around that time because we went through that. We organized a bunch of students, and then fast forward, we organized against deportations, stopping a lot of deportations, worked against SB 1070, worked against stopping Joe Arpaio, who was a sheriff who was racially profiling. We sued him through the ACLU. He was found guilty of racial profiling and then was pardoned by Trump. But anyhow, I'll pass it on to my coworker. We'll keep talking. It's a juicy conversation.
Thank you, Dulce. Yeah, we've known each other for a while now. The immigrant rights world is very small. Jose Patiño, originally from Mexico. I came to the country when I was 6 years old. My grandparents were braceros. They worked in the fields. If you're not familiar with the bracero program, I know the professor mentioned it, which was during World War II, lack of labor, the US recruited farm workers from Mexico to come north and work in the fields at lower wages, sometimes wouldn't pay them, and were often deported. So when my grandpa was here recently, we just spend hours and just talking the stories and how he just got on a truck, went with somebody, found somebody else, and like just navigated up north and like got job to job. So it was really, for me, it was just very amazing how he navigated the world and how sometimes they were deported on a weekly basis, and he just kept going because of his family. So to me, family is very important. We migrated in 95. For a little context, in Mexico, at that time, in 1994, there was a presidential election. The very popular Coloso was running, and he was assassinated because of a lot of things that we don't know yet. But then there was another president who came in, and Mexico went to an economic struggle. And since NAFTA was created, the Mexican government thought it would be a great idea to devalue the peso to increase exports. What ended up happening is that it didn't work out that well. The Mexican government needed a bailout from the US and the World Fund and the International Monetary Fund, and a lot of Mexicans lost their savings overnight. So I saw a lot of families in 95 leaving. I had no idea that was going on. I just like, oh, they're just going up north and they'll come back. Because that's what a lot of times the men did. It would just go up north for years and come back. And that's what we came. I thought we were just going to be here for a couple of years and then go back. But we we stayed, and we're still here. Have a little bit different trajectory just because getting involved. I never thought I was going to go to college. That was never the idea. I always knew that I was undocumented. Since the first day I got here, my mom is like, hey, you're undocumented. Be careful with police. Be careful doing these things. And as I was growing up, I did one school because my mom is like, that's your job, do well in school. And my dad is like, on the weekends, you got to work in construction with me. So you learn a trade, how to survive. And my dad took me to construction since I was in the 5th grade. So every weekend or vacations, we went there. And when I was a little bit older, around like 15, 16 years old, I asked him like, well, why didn't you study? Had no idea. And he's like, well, because he only has a 1st grade education. My parents both have a 1st grade education. They dropped out because they were the oldest of the family that needed to help support in Mexico. And then I asked him, and he's like, las palabras no entran cuando se tiene hambre, meaning the words don't enter when you're hungry. So it gave me a realization of the privilege that I had, that I could sit in a classroom. I could be an AC. I didn't have the best education. We can't have the best textbooks, but I had that opportunity that my parents didn't have, that thousands of people didn't have. So for me, ever since that, I was like, I'm gonna make sure I do the best in school. I got a scholarship like Dulce, got accepted to all 3 universities. And similar to Dulce, I remember when the letter came in and we're all happy that we got a scholarship and we got accepted to university, and then Prop 300 passed. And then then I got another letter saying that you're still accepted, but you're no longer eligible for the scholarship. And I remember my mom crying, and that just motivated me. I was like, I'll figure it out. I don't know how, I'll just figure it out. I asked my counselors. They're smart, they're older, they know stuff. They didn't, and they just sent me to other organizations. Came to the colleges and nobody knew. And I just went around from like January to June, asking folks, getting involved, going to marches, doing whatever I could. and finally got a phone number that private scholarship had been opened up. You could apply. Came to ASU and they told me that I was going to be here. And for me, I've always taken that approach, that I felt very lucky, even though I had the grades, even though I did really well in school. But I felt lucky to be able to get that phone number because I had friends who were just as talented, who were just as hardworking, who didn't get that opportunity. And I feel a little bit of sense of responsibility to be able to give those opportunities to young people. And that's the work that we did at Aliento, the Prop 308 campaign, which we started in 2018. A lot of years, a lot of work, because we felt that responsibility that some of us were lucky enough to get a scholarship. Some of us were lucky enough to find that phone number, that many of our friends, family members didn't. And we wanted to make sure that everybody had that opportunity. So now in the state of Arizona, if you're undocumented or a DACA recipient, you're eligible for in-state tuition as well as for publicly funded scholarships, whether merit-based, whether it be sports. And it's something that Arizona voters voted last November. So hopefully some of you voted in the last election, and hopefully you voted in favor. And for that, I'm very thankful.
I think one of the things I always try to tell people or policymakers is that, this affects people and this affects families. And there's a lot of human suffering because of people's undocumented status or mixed family status. And what can we do to mitigate that? And sometimes I'm more hopeful that the change is coming. And I'll give you two examples. In January of this year, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Secretary of Labor Marty Walsh stated, and I quote, "We need immigration reform in America. America has always been a country that has depended on immigration. Right now, we don't have a good immigration policy. There are jobs available right now in the US that we don't have enough people for. The threat to the American economy long-term is not inflation, it's about immigration. It's not having enough workers." End of quote. This was January 2023. Again, January 2023, Alejandro Mayorkas, Homeland Security Secretary, said, "Unscrupulous employers who prey on the vulnerability of non-citizen workers harm all workers and disadvantage businesses who play by the rules. We will hold these predatory actors accountable by encouraging all workers to assert their rights, report violations they have suffered or observed, and cooperate in labor standards investigations." So there's an acknowledgement by two very high-level government officials that the immigration system is broken and that the undocumented are being taken advantage of. And so is there hope that there will be change in the future, acknowledging what they have said? I'm just curious.
Thank you, Rosema. I have a question for you guys because obviously I live in Texas. It's a difficult state for immigration, as you well know. I was over at the region of El Paso Juarez just a couple of days ago, and you can see the National Guard, Texas National Guard vehicles deployed. You see lots of wires, lots of fences, barbed wire. You see the DPS, the Texas DPS vehicles, and then the Border Patrol, and you see the wall, and so it's like a political theater, grand political theater, right? But Arizona is turning. Recently, I've read 2 books on Arizona and how Arizona is changing, and I think you guys have been witnesses to what is happening in Arizona. The books, I think, both of them, one by Slavin and one by Magana here at ASU. I think were very telling. It was an incredible coincidence that I got both manuscripts at the same time because they were so similar, but they were not coordinated texts, right? But they were really interesting stories about what is happening with politics in Arizona. Tell us from your side, from your perspective, what has changed in Arizona? How have you participated and how have you felt that change? What political coalitions have brought it about? What actions, particularly because in 2010, when SB 1070 was in the books, this was a pretty rough place. When Arpaio was in Maricopa County, that was a pretty rough place. And within 10 years, you turn it around. Tell us the story of Arizona, Jose, and then we'll come back.
I'll go ahead and I'll pass it to Dulce. Every time we tell the story, there's the celebration, but there's also pain. And when I go back to the pain is because during the 1070 years, the prior years, like children now who are now young adults, right? They were set down by their parents. They were told, hey, you're 10 years old, you're the oldest. If we don't come home, you're gonna be the woman or the man or the woman of the household. This is the phone number of a friend or uncle, call them. Make sure to get your siblings and take them home. And those kids will never forget that. They won't forget the scars that happened when police came to the house and took away their parents. They won't forget how it felt when you came home and that person was gone. They won't forget how for years and years you were told that you were this monster out there. And a lot of us turned that pain into anger in terms of like, what can we do? That's when we came out of the shadows. I remember coming out of the shadows in 2010 saying I was undocumented, the front page of the AC Central. I didn't know what that actually was going to happen. I just thought like go over there and talk to people. Okay, I went and then came back, and then I was in my engineering class and my professor was like, hey, you're famous. Can you sign this? And I was like, what? And I was afraid because I was like, what are my classmates gonna say? And they were all very supportive. And I was very surprised. And that has also gone to the story of it because a lot of us have been able to be in places that otherwise we wouldn't be able to. Where now you have people who know their nannies, their landscapers, their construction workers, now their friends, their families. And that was able, through that pain, we were able to build coalitions that otherwise wouldn't exist. That otherwise it would be very difficult because we disagree philosophically in the way we see things. We were able to build a coalition with the business community, although their intention for Prop 3 was like, how do we increase economic output and how do we see these students as people who are gonna help us make more money? But we were willing to put that to the side because we needed to make sure that our kids had an opportunity that other people don't have. And that has allowed people through that suffering and feeling that badly, then we could build those coalitions that otherwise wouldn't exist. So sad part is that you have to go through a lot of pain in order to have the ability to create joy and celebration.
Thank you, Jose. I got involved back in 2002. That's like over 20 years ago, 22 years ago, when we were trying to pass the DREAM Act. The DREAM Act was initially introduced in 2001. And the idea behind the DREAM Act is that Congress, if passed, it would create a path towards citizenship for undocumented youth, like myself at the time. And I remember here in Arizona in particular, there was this attorney, her name was Emilia Bañuelos, and she actually turned out to be our family lawyer who I have an aunt who's a US citizen who had sponsored us to become US citizens or to get a worker permit. But that took forever. That took like over 13 years to be able to get our permanent green card. In the process though of waiting, I had seen Emilia Bañuelos on the news and she was saying, we need students to come out. The DREAM Act is up in Congress and we need to organize. And I saw my mom, I told my mom, I'm like, Mom, Emilia Bañuelos is on the news. We know her, she's our lawyer. She's asking for students to come out and protest. So I think that's how it starts. It starts with a spark and it starts with a call to action, which me being the community activist, I always have calls to actions for everybody, get involved, right, take action. So I think change is possible. I'm an idealist in that sense. Meanwhile, though, the DREAM Act not passing over the past 22 years has made me very jaded about the system. I'm not going to lie. But going back to that moment of like getting involved with that call to action, I went to a radio station and I just shared my story. I'm an undocumented student. And back then, 22 years ago, people would not open up or share. We were what you would call in the shadows or in the closet, right? About being undocumented. You never wanted to share in public that you didn't have papers because of the animosity, because of the hostility towards immigrants here in the state with Dora Pio chasing after immigrants. You never wanted to come out and say your story. But back then I was sharing my story openly along with my best friend Silvia, who if you all are able to, she has her book that came out and she's going to be having an event today at the art gallery of Genaro Garcia in downtown. So I can give you the details and the flyers outside. Anyhow, the point is that the DREAM Act has not passed, right? And that is one piece of legislation that has been used for a long time by both parties, both political parties, to basically say, we're going to support dreamers, come vote for us, and we're going to pass this. For years, that has been happening, election through election through election, and we still don't have the DREAM Act. And so dreamers are, I would say, who are pushing the envelope, right? We got DACA out of that. That is one sort of extension of the DREAM Act, but it doesn't solve all of our issues. DACA folks are going through a lot of issues, having to pay every 2 years for a worker visa, having to pay a lot of money to go through this process. It costs so much money to go through the immigration system. And the truth is there's over 11 million people, multicultural immigrants that from all over the world, Black, Indigenous, people of color, people who are Asian American, Pacific Islanders. We have a vast majority of immigrants. And so the face of immigration in this country is very multicultural. Yet in Arizona, it seems to be very Latinx focused, but there's immigrants from all over the world here in Arizona as well. A lot of engineers from all over the world. My husband's Polish, from Poland, and a Polish immigrant. And so anyhow, I do think there's hope. I do think that there are people that have years of experience in organizing marches, protests, knowing policy, knowing the behind the scenes, but we don't have the votes in Congress. The second time the DREAM Act was introduced was in 2010, right? Was it 2010, 2011, the lame duck? 2010. We were outside of the late Senator John McCain's office before he passed away. We did a hunger strike to try and get him to vote yes on the second time that the DREAM Act was presented in Congress. And he walked out. He walked out of the vote. And we had been going like 11 days without eating so that he would pay attention to us, so that he, outside of his office, so that he could vote yes for dreamers that were protesting outside his office, so he could give us a chance, an opportunity to get documents. And he walked out. So we need people that are going to be caring, that care about people and immigrants and families. Like, this is having a real impact on a lot of people. A lot of our students, sometimes because we don't have the opportunity, sometimes they're suicidal. I know that I went into a huge depression when I thought I was going to lose my scholarship. And my mom would be like, don't give up. Don't lose hope. Keep going. And continuing my education was the only way out until I finally got my green card. And then I started working at the ACLU with a bunch of amazing attorneys trying to stop anti-immigrant laws. And then later on, I worked and became a executive director at an environmental justice organization with environment and immigration both go hand in hand. I'll leave it there because there's so much to share, but I'll pass it on to whoever wants to go next.
Yeah, and so to answer your question about Arizona, I front loaded a little bit of my research and my introductory, but I'll talk a little bit about my personal as well in relation to your question. So I moved to Arizona 3 years ago to take this great job at ASU. I moved from the state of New Mexico, from Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is where I did my PhD at. But I originally grew up in California in the early 90s. And so I'm a product, what I would like to call myself is a Prop 186 baby, right? I went through Prop 186 in the early 90s, which was a bill that would have essentially supported by the governor at that time, Pete Wilson, Republican California governor, who essentially wanted to put pressure on immigrant families. If we take away the basic resources, they're going to want to leave the state, right? Because there's too many immigrants in California at the time, early 90s. And so the bill attacked access to public health, access to public education, which was a charge against the federal government's ruling of immigrants having access to K through 12, right? Among other things, right? And so my family was one of those families that was early on asking, should we stay in California, right? We had just arrived essentially 4 years early in the 1990s I was only 8 years old when Prop 186 happened in California. And even though I was only 8 years old in elementary school, I could tell you that radicalized me. That built a critical consciousness in me where I said, what's happening? Why does my neighborhood look the way it does? My parents tell me that we come to the United States for a better life, but I'm looking outside, there's racial tensions. The Rodney King beating had just happened by police in Los Angeles. We had a lot of police brutality happening in LA. The LA riots or LA uprising, as I like to call them, happened in the city. So I'm looking outside and all of these things were going, but I also saw a lot of activism, right? I saw a lot of youth and particularly walking out of the high schools and at an early age asking myself, why was this happening, right? So that started my political consciousness life. I'll move a little bit further, moving to New Mexico, Albuquerque, New Mexico. When I first started arriving there, I got there in 2012, right? And so I get there in August of 2012. DACA's announced in June of 2012, right? I went through my whole undergrad experience undocumented without in-state tuition or access to state aid because the California DREAM Act hadn't passed yet. I had been advocating as an undergrad for in-state tuition, the California DREAM Act and other things. Doesn't happen until I leave the state, which is fine. Other people now benefit from that policy. And I get to New Mexico and I get DACA and my life radically changes, right? Because now I have a graduate assistantship. Now I could do research with professors, right? And so that was radical change. But the other thing that happened as I started getting organized with community and working with nonprofits there in Albuquerque, I started meeting a large population of folks who had been leaving Arizona to states like New Mexico, right? And I had, of course, heard SB 1070 and other policies, other laws here in Arizona, but I hadn't experienced that. And even though I was being marginalized in a place like California, I still had certain privileges that I knew were not the case here in Arizona. And I was learning through that firsthand from some of the refugee populations. And I call them refugees because they left Arizona in that kind of status, if you will, right? And so when I came back to ASU, one of the things that I started doing research as well was starting to interview a lot of those families that left Arizona to places like New Mexico. And one of the things I kept hearing was, if things were better in Arizona, we would, without a heartbeat, we would be back in Arizona, right? The labor markets are better in Arizona than in New Mexico because one of the things they experienced was poverty due to lack of market in a place like New Mexico being one of the poorest states in the nation, right? Very pro-immigrant in many ways, policy-wise, but also having many challenges as far as opportunities. The other thing was New Mexico is a very highly militarized state in terms of the running joke in New Mexico is unless you work for education or you work for the military or the government, you don't have a job in New Mexico, right? So it's as simple as going 2 miles south from the university in Albuquerque and you run into a military base that captures like all of southern Albuquerque, right? And so I mention all of that because many of the families that left here felt a little bit more free in terms of immigration persecution, but local law enforcement also had a big play in it. So, but many of them were saying, if we could come back to Arizona, we would, right? If we didn't face the trauma and the persecution that we did. The last thing I'll mention is now I live in the city of Chandler, right? In the East Valley, where I'm also learning a lot about the local community and the history there. When SB 1070 happened and some of those actions happened in the late 2000s, in 1997, there was also the Chandler Roundup, right? Which happened for 5 days where local law enforcement collaborated with immigration, where they went to basically, they had information where to go into work sites, as well as homes, local businesses, and other things. And so as I've been working with local community and nonprofits there, one of the things I keep hearing about is the city is now on this model as it's become one of the largest cities in Arizona and experiencing a lot of diversity. It's wanting to really connect with the Latinx immigrant population there, But the problem is that many of those families have not passed that trauma that existed from the 1997 roundup, where you'll basically see a local, like a Chandler Police Department event for the Latinx community, and literally nobody shows up. When something happens in some of the mobile homes or some of the low-income homes, and they do not call the police to this day, right? And when something happens in their education system with their children, they're still not acting accordingly to some of these actions. So that's my entry point into talking about Arizona and thinking about from the periphery some of the things that I have learned about Arizona in those contexts as well.
Yeah, yeah, we'll open it to the audience. If anybody has a question, or a comment. Anybody? Yeah, I'll step over there and bring the microphone to you so everybody can hear you.
I think we need it.
We probably, yeah, it'll be better. Here you go.
Hi, my name is Manfred. I work at the Center for Gender Equity in Science and Technology over here at ASU. And my question is, the easy answer to this whole immigration problem is Congress got to fix it, right? We've heard that many times. Well, Congress hasn't done anything. So how do you get these guys to move? Or, is there, or like you said before, is there any hope left?
I have a solution.
Wanna go?
One of the things that I have advocated for is the enforcement of the employer sanctions that were passed in 1986 with the Immigration Control and Reform Act. That act says that if an employer hires people knowingly and willingly without the benefit of proper documentation, they can be fined, they can go to jail. And that's what we need to do. The employers, the people who exploit, who are profiting, who are not wanting a legal pathway for people and pay people under the table, avoiding taxes, not paying them benefits, Social Security, all the accoutrements that we want for ourselves, they're the ones that need to be fined. They're the ones that need to go to jail, and they'll be the ones that will demand immigration reform. Because there are a lot of visas. I mean, like in Yuma has about 6,500 workers that come every year to pick the crops, and they come in on an H-2A visa. And why can't we have those type of visas for other sectors like construction, landscaping, and other things? So my suggestion is go after the employers, and they'll be the ones to clamor for immigration reform.
Yeah, locally, I think I have a better answer because I a little bit more control. National level, I've been advocating, and in 2017 to 2018, we stayed in DC first in church floors from November. We drove 20 of us, 44-hour drive, and stayed until February when we had the boat on DACA. And we were able to meet with all the senators at least twice, with about half of the House members. And key on my lessons is that you have to have like the Holy Trinity for immigration reform. First is the business side, so you can push individuals, making the economic argument, why is this needed, having those leverages. The other folks are the activists. Those advocates are gonna humanize and fight and be on the streets. And then the missing part that I think it's the faith. We tell the faith community help us be there. And that was the missing gap that existed before, that has been very quiet in the conversation. And then the other one that I would add is labor. It is very much a labor issue. Very much unions are against immigration reform. Unions are against bringing more immigrants. Unions don't want competition. Not all unions, but a lot of them, and that makes it very difficult to have an honest conversation. So it's a difficult thing to do because unions typically advocate for workers' rights, but they also don't want more individuals to bring into the fold. So it complicates it, but I lie my hope not on the politicians, but on myself and the people that I know with. And so long as I believe in myself, so long as I think I have something to contribute, I'm always going to believe, and I'm always going to be there, because that's something I can control. I can't control other people. I don't have the money. don't have the millions of dollars to give out to politicians or to lobby, but I have myself and what I can do and the relationships that I build. And we're probably going to keep fighting until those things align. And right now it's not the case.
Also to, yes, and Iracema's point, I have heard of employers that go above and beyond to sponsor their workers who are on visas or who are DACA, who have some form of status, even if it's as small as DACA, right? It's a provisional visa, I guess you would say. But there are employers that can sponsor people to stay here and get actual permanent resident cards. It is possible to organize. So if we could organize the business community to sponsor more people, that's one way in. The second way in, I would say that we have seen works for undocumented folks is that they start their own LLCs. They can start their own companies here. So they don't have to depend on anyone, even though that doesn't make them free of deportation. That still is a way that they can become independent and have a way to sustain themselves and belong and contribute to society and have some form of independence. But I think it's going to take another whole wave of revolution of like people coming together in a strong coalition with the folks that Jose was mentioning. It takes a lot of coalition building and people working together to really push. And I think that we pushed really hard in the past few years, in the past 20 years, I would say since 1986 was the last immigration reform we had, which is how my tia, my auntie, that's how she became a citizen and she sponsored us, was in 1986 through Ronald Reagan. And we haven't seen an immigration reform since.
I think I'm a little bit more skeptical, politically speaking, because I saw an interview with John Boehner. And I remember going to Rice University in 2013 to talk about immigration reform. It was a particular project when I was at the University of Texas. And then I went to Rice University to work on that project. And the bill, I think 2013, 2014, the bill was clearly the last effort of the Gang of Eight, which is a group of bipartisan senators. And the bill passed in the Senate. I don't remember if it was 66 or 68 votes, but it passed in the Senate. And Boehner single-handedly stopped it in the House. He just simply did not allow the bill to progress to the floor. I think it would have passed, but he didn't. And then, of course, later he gave an interview and he said, I should have done it. I could have done it. I regret not having done it, but it's done. And so clearly we're in the hands of just very few politicians who have essential I guess, veto power practically because of the position they're in to block almost anything. And I want to add to the comment that you're going to say, see if you guys can add to this. When it comes to what's going on at the border today, does that help or does that hurt the cause of those who are already here?
I'll just push back a little bit on your comment on John Boehner because I met with them during that time. I'm a little unconventional, to say the least, stopping immigration buses and all that stuff. I found out where his house was in DC. And so every day for about a month, I went at 5 a.m. Secret Service was there and prayed for him. And then we were able to speak with them. And then afterwards, follow him to Ohio to talk to him and his neighbors. And then built a good relationship with some of the lawmakers at that time. And what we found out that it wasn't simply as the speaker bringing a bill for a floor, because the Tea Party, what had done is they made an agreement in order for you to be the speaker, Boehner. That means that we have veto power. That means that if there's a bill that you bring up for floor and we don't like it, we can call a vote for the new speaker, and then automatically that takes precedence and they will remove him out of office.
Which is what they did to McCarthy just now.
Yeah, so they did the same thing. So therefore, even though Boehner wanted it, he was not courageous enough, we can say that, but I think also would have cost him. And practically speaking, parliamentarian, it would have not happened. So that's, I think, the other danger that we have. The way the Republican Party is, and you must have a Democratic House. You can have a Republican House because you have those individuals who would basically destroy the institution in order for them not to get their way. I think most people that I talk to agree that the way the border situation and the border crisis has been handled, the humanitarian crisis, doesn't allow to have a space for a conversation, an open conversation, because the Biden administration has been so inadequate in their response in terms of supporting the migrants, creating a pathway for them to apply and creating all this supplies. But at the same time, instituting Title 42, which a lot of people call fascist under Trump, but they don't say it right now under Biden. So you see the double talk from the progressive left. And then the Republicans and the far right believe that the border is wide open. And what it has done is widen the gaps. So my goal, my job as Aliento is go and try to fill those. I go talk to those Tea Party people in Prescott or Buckeye or Fountain Hills. You can say that I like pain, you can say that, but my role is how can I contribute and make this stronger? And that's the role that I want to have. And it just doesn't help. Having the border issue, the way it's been framed by the media, also the media doesn't help. The media, their job, they told me my job is not to help you move an issue across. My job is to get clicks. So you have to learn some of that as well. But I just think that unless we change the conversation around the border and border security and what we are as a nation, we're always going to struggle because immigration always changes. We can look in this room, when I was here several years ago, it would have been different. And you can look at Arizona, Texas is changing. And I think a lot of people are coming from a place of fear because they just don't know what's going on.
Borders. I'm against borders. And I'm going to share why. I'm all about open borders around the world. And the reason for that, I'm about bridges and creating bridges so that the violence stops, because there's a lot of violence that happens with borders in place. Back when I was at the ACLU of Arizona, the American Civil Liberties Union, I had a hotline that I ran where I would answer the phone of people that were being impacted by SB 1070 back in 2012. I started answering the phone. We had over 6,000 phone calls from people all around the country and around Arizona that were being impacted by SB 1070, but also all kinds of other calls started happening. So when I would pick up the phone, we had calls from people that were looking for migrants, family members that had crossed the border and they never heard back from them. And we were very close at the time also working, because of that hotline, we had to work collaboratively with other nonprofits that were doing border work so that we could get people connected to resources so they could find their family members that they'd lost when they were crossing the border. And we work closely with No Más Muertes. And if you go into No Más Muertes, they have a website and they have a list of all the migrants that have died crossing the border, crossing the desert. That's why I'm against borders, because there's so much violence that could be prevented, so much family pain, so much that could be stopped if we didn't have borders. If animals can migrate freely, why can we not migrate freely? We're also animals. We're humans, but we're animals. We're a type of species. We should be able to migrate freely across the world without having to face violence. If you look at the immigrants' rights movement, the mariposa monarca is the symbol, has been the symbol for the immigrants' rights movement. And if you look at the story and the navigation and the immigration process, the migration process of the mariposa monarca, they fly across borders from Canada all the way to Michoacán, Mexico. And they have a migration process. And I'm just like, why can't we do that? Why can't we migrate freely? Just like businesses around the world migrate freely. We have businesses across the world. Kentucky Fried Chicken. I was in Europe the other day. In 2015, I went to Europe. I was in Spain. They had Kentucky Fried Chicken there. So like, why, if businesses can migrate, you can eat Kentucky Fried Chicken over there. Why can't we have people move the same way freely? Right? Do y'all feel me on this? Am I going? Okay. Yeah, I thought so. If we can have businesses be international, then why can't humans move internationally without having to face violence? So that is why I'm against borders. I'm for bridges. I'm for people having the ability to move freely throughout the world. But there is a lot of violence that's faced, especially, I don't know if you recall what happened in Texas with the Haitian community. So there's all this anti-Blackness too that happens, right? With the Haitian community, that they were being chased down by Border Patrol on horses, which was awful to see. Do y'all remember these images? It was like a few years ago. We saw it all over the news. Haitian Black immigrants are now in Mexico borders as well, trying to get in, trying to find refuge. So I think that we need to improve. Obviously, we know there's an issue where there's a problem, and the border is causing a lot of violence, and I'm not for it. So if we can create a way in which people can move and create more visas, create a path, create an entryway so that people can move flow better throughout the world, I'm for that. And I'm going to keep advocating for that. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. I'll pass it on.
Yeah, no, I'm on board with what Jose and Dulce have shared. Just to add a little bit, right before this panel, I was looking at some data and some statistics and yada, yada, yada. And every single year, there's polls that come out that show that most Americans, or a majority of Americans, support immigration reform, support a pathway for undocumented youth, and so forth, so forth. But as for all the reasons that have already been outlined, that I'm not going to get into either, it doesn't happen, right? Is that truly a democracy? I mean, I seriously got to ask the question. And just to add to Dulce's comment about, no borders, the other thing that happens with that is that sometimes within the Latinx community, and particularly and across other communities as well, we need to think of immigrant rights as an intersectional movement and intersectional advocacy group, right? Because a lot of it has to do with anti-Blackness, as you're mentioning. Now there's borders in Mexico with Central America as well, and that's American funded as well. Anti-queerness, Jose mentioned the missing piece of the faith community. Guess why? Anti-queerness, right? And so we got to be pushing all of these folks who are our tios, our tias, our family members to start having these conversations if we're going to get on those things. The attacks that's happening on critical race theory, ethnic studies across the country, that's immigration issues, right? And so forth, because what's happening is they don't want us to tell the stories that we keep hearing up here in the panel about people in different places around the US. That's a form of borders, right? That's happening. So we need to think about some of those issues and also think of them as, that matters to me because I believe in immigrant rights. We need to go and fight against, critical race theory or other forms of oppression as well. So that's all I'll say on that matter.
Well, I thank you all for participating. I'll give the last word to Dr. Coronado to close the panel. Thank you, everyone, for participating. It's been a pleasure. And afterwards, please stay and have a drink and a cookie and talk to the panelists. Iracema, your word.
No,
Last word
thank
is
you
yours.
very much for coming. We appreciate your kind attendance, and these are complicated issues. And just remember that there are people that are impacted, children who are suffering, and these are the future. And so one of the things that I'm very concerned is the impact of this mixed status family, the lack of progress in this area, and how it affects our children. And it's something that I'm very close and dear to. I just published a book on that topic with other participants. It's a co-edited book, but it's something that we all need to pay attention to. And many of them are our students, many of them are our neighbors, many of them are our family, many of them are our friends, and we need to do our best to promote this immigration reform. Hopefully one day soon. Jose?
Yeah, I just wanted to. You guys got me going. I don't know if it's a good thing. Yeah, one thing is, we were talking about how the border looks. I remember when I was 6 years old and we crossed the border and it was basically a CBS and we crossed underneath and it was so much different than it is now. And then have 6 cousins who are undocumented. They migrated in the last 3 years. One of them just came a few months ago and they talked about their journey, which was you got to basically pay $10,000 to get transported from southern Mexico to northern Mexico. So you got to navigate the military, the Mexican military, because they're going to try to get their cut. Then you have to try to pay off the cartels or the people who are trafficking who are going to cross you through the US-Mexico border. And then you got to pay the people for there to take you to a safe house in the US, somewhere on the reservation. the native land, and then from then pay to where you're end up destination. And thankfully for our cousins is that we were able to support that. So therefore they don't have to indebt themselves to somebody else, but that happens a lot, and we see that. And then I asked them, like, why did you make this journey? It's like, you risked your life. You were lost in the desert for several days and you didn't have water. You indebted yourself. And then he tells me, well, what option do I have? Like, I'm hungry. My siblings are hungry. My mom is hungry. In Mexico, we're making what I make here in a day, I make over there in a week. And this is the opportunity. This is the land. And so long as that is still the case, it doesn't matter if it's a 50-foot wall of wires, whatever, people are going to figure out a way around. Because so long as human beings want to survive and they have kids and they care about them, like, nobody wants to tell their kid that, hey, I don't have food for you, or I don't have a shelter for you. And they're going to do it legally if they can. If not, they're going to do it unlawfully, because people want to better their lives. And immigration is going to be with us. Even if we have immigration reform, something else is going to come up and it's going to continue, because all of us, some of us are not here from Arizona. We migrated. Some of us have legal papers. But for example, you came from Texas into Arizona before, better position, better job, better outlook, right? People are going to do that. We do that internally. People are going to do it internationally. Some people have the blessing and the privilege of being born in this country, having this privilege. Other people don't, and they have to figure out a way forward. And they're going to keep doing that. So how do we help them?
Thank you all. Thank you so much for coming.